The hall is alive with fire and noise. Torches sputter against carved wooden beams blackened with years of smoke. Horns roar, mead splashes, men shout verses of half-remembered sagas until the very walls tremble with their drunken chant. You are at the center, a young bride whose world has narrowed to the weight of a rough wool cloak pressed over your shoulders. The air is heavy with sweat, smoke, and ale, clinging so thick it steals your breath. Faces leer from the shadows, not tender witnesses, but warriors, scarred and eager, their laughter carrying the rhythm of ritual. Every eye is fixed not on the feast, but on you. This night is not yours, it belongs to them. What should have been private, the quiet trembling of a first union, is made a spectacle, demanded as proof, shouted as honor. Your pain will be their entertainment, your silence their shame. And as you feel the chants rising like a tide, the truth settles like ice in your chest. In this world, a wedding night is not the beginning of love, it is the triumph of the clan. But behind the myths of golden ships and glory of raids, shadows remain, rituals too horrific to survive in the sagas. If glimpses into these forgotten shadows grip you, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It helps us unearth more of history's buried truths together. The Viking Age stretched from the late 8th to the 11th centuries, spilling from the icy fjords of Scandinavia into Britain, Ireland, Francia, and the Slavic world. Popular memory celebrates it as an age of fearless explorers and shipwrights, but marriage, seemingly mundane, was one of its darkest institutions. Viking wedding nights were not tender beginnings, but communal performances designed to bind women as property, seal alliances, and display dominance. Icelandic law codes, Norse sagas, and clerical chroniclers like Adam of Bremen and Ibn Fodlan give us glimpses into what the myths tried to bury: rituals of humiliation, forced consummations, and the systematic reduction of intimacy into legal contracts. What today is retold as romantic Viking weddings often masks a brutal truth, deliberately sanitized by later storytellers. The deeper we dig, the more these rituals reveal an empire of shadows. The wedding feast did not end with laughter. It ended with law. Behind the songs of harps and the clinking of horns lay an institution, older and harsher than any fleeting passion. Marriage as a contract, not between two hearts, but between families, clans, and in some cases, entire villages. To modernize, it is tempting to imagine a Viking bride blushing under garlands of flowers, welcomed into her new home. But the record left behind, law codes, sagas, and scattered clerical chronicles, speak of something else entirely: a ritualized humiliation designed to strip a woman of her past, her name, and her privacy in one single night. The saga writers and Icelandic lawmakers used euphemisms to disguise these moments, phrases like "the bedding was witnessed" or "the blood was shown." What this meant in practice was far more chilling. The consummation of a marriage was not a private union, but a public performance. In many halls, once the feast was over, the bride would be escorted to the bed by the entire household. Witnesses stood by, sometimes chanting verses, sometimes jeering, until proof of her virginity was demanded. A stained sheet, a cry in the darkness, or a boast from the groom. These became tokens of legitimacy. Without them, alliances could crumble, dowries be revoked, entire families ruined. The horror lay not simply in the act itself, but in the systematic transformation of intimacy into spectacle. One saga recounts the marriage of Olaf Tryggvason, who later became king of Norway. His bride was paraded before the warriors, who carried torches and demanded proof that the union was complete before the night ended. Chroniclers who wrote centuries later softened these accounts, presenting them as quaint traditions, but the chilling undercurrent is hard to ignore. A bride was not merely a wife, she was a public offering. The transactional nature of these rituals was embedded in the law. The Gulathing and Frostathing codes, two of the oldest Norwegian legal collections, made explicit the fines and punishments for refusing consummation. A bride who resisted was labeled Nidinger, a coward, a dishonor. Such a status could destroy not only her, but her entire family's standing. To be named Nithing was worse than death. It stripped a person of protection under the law, leaving them open to violence without recourse. Thus, refusal was not an option. It was not simply the will of a husband that weighed upon her, but the entire machinery of Viking society. Even the economic framework reinforced this dehumanization. A bride was measured in silver and cattle, her body equated to livestock. Bride price, munder, was paid by the groom's family to secure her, while a dowry, hymenphilgia, was demanded from her own kin. Both sides were investing not in love, but in breeding potential and alliance security. In many cases, if the marriage was not consummated, these payments could be challenged or revoked. The pressure to produce proof of intimacy was therefore not only cultural but financial. Families watched closely, eager to ensure their investment was validated. Consider the chilling implication. A woman's most intimate moment was also her receipt. Her body served as the ledger of contract, the proof of transaction. Contemporary accounts deepen the dread. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century about the pagan practices of Scandinavia, noted that Viking feasts often blurred the line between ritual and law. In his description of weddings, the union of bride and groom was likened to a sacrifice, a necessary act to seal a covenant not only between families but also with the gods themselves. This framing added another layer of coercion. Resistance was framed not just as defiance of the groom, but blasphemy against divine order. The sagas, too, preserve whispers of blood rituals tied to weddings. In Njál's saga, disputes over virginity and consummation erupt into feuds and killings. Men's honor was directly tied to women's bodies, making every wedding night a potential spark for violence. Virginity was not a private matter of purity, but a communal resource, guarded and weaponized by law and custom. And then there were the captives. Raiding was the lifeblood of Viking expansion, and with raids came thralls, slaves taken from Ireland, the Baltic, or Slavic lands. Many of these women were forcibly married into households, their weddings, little more than staged ceremonies masking systemic abduction and rape. Archaeological digs in Viking settlements reveal iron shackles buried near domestic sites, suggesting that the line between wife and slave was thinner than sagas admitted. To a Viking chieftain, a captive bride could be paraded as both trophy and political tool. One particularly haunting testimony comes not from Scandinavia, but from Ibn Fadlan, the Arab envoy who encountered the Rusas, a Norse people settled along the Volga. He described not only their weddings, but also their funerary rites, where slave women were made to drink, sing, and eventually submit to ritual death alongside their masters. Though his focus was on funerals, the echo of these practices into marriage is clear. Women were bound into cycles of ritual violence, their bodies used as both stage and altar. What emerges from all these fragments is a picture of systematic psychological warfare. Women entering these unions were stripped not only of autonomy, but of privacy, forced to enact their most vulnerable moments before a community trained to see them as symbols of honor and property. It was an industrial-scale dehumanization, hidden beneath euphemisms, preserved in ledgers, and celebrated in sagas. And for every bride who bled on a sheet, there were countless others who lived in the shadow of fear. Young girls promised from childhood, captives dragged from burning villages, thralls whose fates were decided by a lord's whim. The wedding night was not an isolated moment of cruelty. It was the culmination of a system that weaponized intimacy, codified humiliation, and left scars not just on individuals, but on entire generations. If the first horror of Viking weddings lay in their spectacle, the second lay in their scale. These were not isolated incidents, nor aberrations born of drunken nights. They were deliberate, codified, and repeated across generations until they became invisible to those who carried them out. To grasp the full terror, one must understand that the Viking Age marriage system was a machine feeding on children, captives, and alliances, reducing intimacy to ritualized humiliation and passing its scars forward like an heirloom. At the heart of this machine were the child brides. The sagas rarely tell their ages outright, but the laws do not lie. Girls of 12 or 13 were considered ready for marriage, 15 was typical. To modern ears, these numbers are appalling, but to Viking families they represented strategy. The younger the bride, the more years she could bear children to cement alliances. The sooner she was placed in a household, the sooner her body could become a vessel for power. Families encouraged early unions, and fathers spoke of their daughters as one might of cattle, an investment to be placed wisely, before someone else claimed the value. Imagine the terror of such a girl. The night she should have been whispering childish fears by the hearth, she was instead dressed in bridal cloth, her hair braided and weighted with ornaments, pushed into a hall echoing with strangers' chants. Her future was not a path she chose, but a bed she could not escape. Chroniclers described fathers proudly handing daughters to men decades older, warriors hardened by raids. The imbalance was deliberate. An older groom held greater wealth, status, and control, ensuring the young bride's absolute submission. Yet even those born free were not spared humiliation. Raids swelled Viking households with captives. Women dragged from Irish monasteries, Anglo-Saxon villages, or Slavic hamlets found themselves paraded as brides, in ceremonies meant less to honor them than to erase them. Archaeological evidence suggests thralls were sometimes forced to take part in bedding rituals that mimicked free marriages, stripped of any distinction between sacred union and servitude. For the warrior returning from conquest, a slave bride was both proof of victory and a means of integrating foreign blood into the clan's growing web. In sagas, such unions are softened, transformed into romances with willing maidens. But clerics who saw the aftermath described broken women, entire communities hollowed by the knowledge that their daughters had been absorbed into enemy households. The systemic nature of these rituals emerges most clearly in the way resistance was punished. Refusal was not simply personal rebellion, it was treason against family and clan. Women who hesitated were mocked in public songs, branded with epithets that stripped them of protection. To be called nothing or coward was to become an outcast, vulnerable to any abuse without recourse to law. In some regions, flogging was permitted. In others, refusal meant the annulment of dowry and bride price, plunging a family into ruin. Thus, the choice to resist was made impossible. A daughter's survival was tethered not only to her own endurance, but to the honor and economic survival of her kin. The cruelty extended beyond the act itself into the psychology of aftermath. Once the bedding ritual was complete, the bride's body was no longer her own. Law codes tracked her duties in chilling detail. How many nights she must spend in her husband's hall, the conditions under which she might be dismissed, the rights of the husband over her children. In some cases, pregnancies were recorded like livestock yields. Surviving ledgers note fertility cycles, ensuring families could plan inheritance and land division with mathematical precision. The intimacy of motherhood was reduced to arithmetic, and yet the horror was not contained within households. It rippled outward into entire communities. Parents scarred their daughters deliberately, burns on the face, maimed limbs, hoping to make them less appealing to raiders who might otherwise claim them as brides. Chronicles from the British Isles mention mothers cutting the hair of daughters and smearing them with ash to disguise them as thralls, hoping to save them from forced unions. Some even hid children in caves or marshes during raid season, knowing the marriage market would hunger for new bodies. This was systematic psychological warfare. Whole societies reshaped their daily rhythms around the dread of wedding rituals. What makes these practices even more chilling is their normalization. Sagas tell of feasts where laughter accompanied the bedding ritual, where men joked about the bride's cries as proof of honor. Priests who later converted Scandinavia condemned these acts, but even Christianity bent to the machine. The Church sanctified marriage while retaining elements of the public consummation, substituting witnesses with priests who recorded unions in ledgers. The spectacle was softened, the language euphemized, but the control remained. Consider, too, the way raids intersected with the marriage economy. Viking expeditions were not random bursts of violence, but carefully timed ventures, often in spring or summer. Scholars argue that part of the timing was linked to the wedding season, when new alliances required fresh brides. Raids provided the human cargo to feed these demands. In some chronicles, the aftermath of conquest is described in bureaucratic terms. 10 women of good condition taken, 5 apportioned to the household, the rest sold. The coldness of such records makes clear that intimacy had been industrialized, women sorted like spoils alongside gold and silver. For the victims, trauma was compounded by ritual. Brides were expected to weep publicly, their tears seen not as shame but as part of the performance. Silence or defiance could be punished, grief was demanded. Even pain became a duty. Chroniclers whisper of women singing laments as they were led to the bed, songs that blurred into chants of submission, half ritual, half cry for help. These echoes reverberated across generations, embedding fear into cultural memory. And perhaps the most haunting element is how thoroughly these rituals were buried. Later retellings of the Viking Age romantic sagas, nationalist myths of the 19th century, scrubbed them clean. The ferocious independence of shield maidens was celebrated, but the systematic suffering of ordinary brides was forgotten. What survived in law codes and chronicles was reinterpreted, softened, stripped of its cruelty. Yet the bones of this truth remain, in archaeological digs of chained thralls, in Icelandic manuscripts that still preserve legal fines for refusal, in the words of outsiders who could not help but recoil at what they saw. In the end, Viking wedding nights were not private beginnings, but communal declarations of ownership. They were spectacles of dominance, enshrined in law, sanctified by ritual, enforced by families, and normalized across centuries. This was the horror buried beneath the myths of longships and sagas, the silent truth that intimacy itself had been weaponized into a tool of empire. By now the individual horror is clear: the trembling bride, the captive paraded as trophy, the child stripped of innocence. But the deeper terror was not in the single hall or the single feast. It lay in the fact that this was not chaos. It was not drunken chants or personal cruelty. It was systematic, woven into the fabric of Viking society, like the patterns carved into their longships. What unfolded on those wedding nights was the visible tip of an entire machine, a structure that fed on human lives and reproduced itself generation after generation. Marriage was the Viking state's invisible skeleton. Feuds could end in blood, but they were more often ended by weddings. Lands were divided, inheritance secured, raiding alliances forged, all with the body of a bride as the currency. This meant the rituals of humiliation were not random acts of savagery. They were essential to the empire's machinery of control. A bride's tears were political theater, a bloodied sheet, a seal of contract. When sagas speak of kings binding their rivals through marriage, the unspoken truth is that the terror inflicted upon women was the glue of diplomacy. To enforce this system, law was not enough. Law was the skeleton, ritual was the muscle. Communal enforcement made sure no bride escaped the humiliation. Families, clans, even neighbors had a stake in seeing the bedding ritual completed. Witnesses guaranteed that alliances could not be questioned, that inheritance claims could not be disputed. The community's intrusion into the most private act ensured that intimacy was never personal, it was always collective property. Even religion bent to the machine. Before Christianization, Norse gods presided over marriage oaths. Freyja, goddess of fertility, was invoked in ceremonies, but her blessings were framed less as love and more as assurance of fertility and submission. After the arrival of Christianity, the Church condemned certain practices but sanctified others, keeping the essence intact. Priests demanded records, witnesses, and proof of consummation, disguising humiliation under holy language. What had once been called sacred duty to clan and gods became sacrament before Christ. The words changed, the machine endured. The most chilling revelation comes in the mathematics of marriage. Viking society calculated the value of a union with terrifying precision. Dowries were measured in ounces of silver, bride prices in cattle. Thralls were classified by age and fertility. Chroniclers note how girls in their mid-teens fetched higher prices than older women, their reproductive years stretching further. Archaeological finds in trade centers like Hedeby and Birka show women's bodies traded in slave markets alongside amber, furs, and weapons. But unlike silver or wool, their value was replenished through childbirth. This is where the system revealed its darkest genius. It was self-perpetuating. Captives bore children who could be raised as members of the clan, their foreign blood folded into the Viking web. Daughters of these unions became the next round of brides, ready to be exchanged again. This cycle ensured the empire fed on itself. Every wedding was both an end and a beginning, an end to one girl's freedom, a beginning to the next generation of captives. In this way, the machine sustained itself, expanding across seas and centuries. When you look at the glittering arc of Viking conquest on a map spreading from Greenland to Kiev, from Dublin to Constantinople, you must also imagine the countless silent arcs drawn inside homes, in beds, in halls where women's tears sealed the lines of empire. Pause and consider this. Entire villages surrendered not because of swords, but because of whispers. The fear of what awaited their daughters on a wedding night could break a community before the first axe was raised. This was psychological warfare on an industrial scale. Terror made domestic, humiliation institutionalized as law, spectacle, and sacred rite. The most grotesque layer of Viking wedding rituals was how they were transformed into spectacle. What began as a legal necessity, the bedding of bride and groom, often escalated into entertainment. Saga fragments and later chronicles whisper of feasts where guests waited eagerly for proof, laughing at the muffled cries that leaked from behind doors, or worse, standing as direct witnesses to the act. The bride's body became theater, her suffering consumed like another course of meat or mead. This was not merely tolerated, it was codified as honor. If the groom failed to perform, or if no proof was offered, his status was questioned. A warrior who could not dominate his bride was mocked as weak, his alliances doubted. In some accounts, disputes over the authenticity of wedding consummations erupted into blood feuds, as though a woman's humiliation were too sacred a ritual to be left in doubt. The irony is chilling. Male pride and clan survival were defended on the altar of female suffering. Indoctrination gave the machine its soul. Religious framing turned brutality into sacred obligation. A Viking groom was told his union embodied not only his family's power, but also the will of the gods. Freyr and Freyja, deities of fertility, were invoked during these nights, their blessings imagined as flowing only through the submission of women. Later, Christian priests replaced these gods with Christ and the saints, but the message remained identical. The bride's obedience was divine mandate. Thus, resistance was not only social rebellion, it was spiritual blasphemy. The timing of raids reveals just how deeply this machine influenced society. Scholars have noted that Viking expeditions were often seasonal, launching in spring and returning by late summer. This was not simply a matter of weather or harvest cycles. Wedding seasons were planned for autumn, after warriors returned with new captives. These women were absorbed into households, either as wives or concubines, feeding both alliance politics and the expanding slave economy. The capture of women was not incidental to raiding, it was strategic. Human cargo was as valuable as gold. Chronicles from the Frankish world complain not only of stolen silver, but of daughters and sisters dragged away to be married in alien halls. Statistics, cold as they are, reveal the scale. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of women were absorbed into Viking households during the 3 centuries of their expansion. Mortality during raids and transport was high. Some scholars suggest up to 15% of captives died en route, but the survivors fed the cycle of coerced unions. This attrition rate was not seen as tragedy, but as acceptable loss, written off alongside spoiled grain or drowned livestock. The system calculated in lives the way merchants calculated in coin, and, the most chilling element, normalization. By the 10th century, entire generations had grown up in this world knowing no other pattern. Young men were raised to cheer at bedding rituals. Young women were told from childhood to weep on command, to treat tears as part of their duty. Parents counseled daughters to endure humiliation in silence, because silence preserved honor. Communities sang songs about weddings that, beneath their jovial verses, carried centuries of institutionalized dread. In this way, horror became heritage. What had begun as brutality hardened into tradition, remembered not as atrocity but as law, religion, and custom. Even after Christianity spread and softened the surface, the skeleton remained intact. Weddings still functioned as tools of property transfer, still demanded proof, still turned women into vessels of alliance. The sagas that romanticize Viking bravery rarely admit this truth, but in the margins of law codes, in the cold lines of ledgers, the reality remains. And so the arc of the Viking Empire, celebrated for its ships and conquests, must also be seen through this lens. An empire sustained not only by steel and sails, but by systematic dehumanization enacted in every hall, on every wedding night, across centuries. The fires in those Viking halls have long since gone out. The sagas, copied by monks centuries later, preserve the gleam of swords and the pride of kings, but leave only whispers of the nights that scarred the nameless. Yet beneath the heroic myths, the truth remains. Intimacy was conscripted into service, weaponized as a spectacle of control, and normalized into the very marrow of society. It is tempting to dismiss these rituals as relics of a barbaric age, practices sealed away in the dark fjords of history, but to do so is to miss the deeper lesson. The Viking wedding night reveals how easily power can twist the most sacred bonds into instruments of domination. When societies prize control over compassion, when contracts eclipse humanity, when the tears of the vulnerable are demanded as proof, then the unthinkable becomes ordinary. Archaeological digs uncover shackles in homes, ledgers noting fertility like livestock, traces of rituals that stripped women of privacy. These are not simply curiosities for scholars, they are testimonies. They remind us that beneath every romanticized myth lies an archive of suffering, waiting for those willing to look. The ledger of history does not forget, it waits for eyes unafraid of its shadows. And yet, to speak of these horrors is not to strip away dignity, but to restore it. By remembering the brides who were forced to weep before clans, the captives turned into trophies, the children pressed into unions they could not comprehend. We lift them from the silence that empire imposed. Their voices may have been drowned in the chants of warriors, but the record endures. And in telling their story, we acknowledge what was taken from them. The scars of such practices ripple outward even today. They live in the cultural memories of regions once raided, in the genetic traces scattered across Europe, in the uneasy legends that still echo in folklore. The Viking Age may have ended nearly a millennium ago, but its shadows remind us how fragile civilization remains when unchecked power makes cruelty into custom. So the next time you hear of Viking romance, of golden weddings beneath torchlight, remember this. Behind the poetry were tears demanded as ritual. Behind the songs were silences enforced by fear. Civilization is always a heartbeat away from forgetting the cost of its own myths. If this history unsettled you as much as it should, subscribe and share in the comments where it struck hardest. We will confront the next buried truth together. Because only by remembering can we deny the shadows their victory.